Hey everyone, and welcome to today's Explainer. We're diving into a really profound re-examination of what is easily one of the most famous declarations in all of biblical history. We're looking at a pivotal, absolutely crucial moment in the book of Ruth. It's what the source text calls a turn of belonging. Now, if you've read or heard the story before, you probably think you know it inside and out, right? But as we analyze the specific passage today, we're going to uncover this hidden, underlying layer of grace that kind of completely flips how we understand human commitment.
Just listen to the absolute conviction in those words. Where you go, I will go, and where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God. I mean, have you ever secretly wondered how a young widow in a desperate, really terrifying situation mustered the sheer willpower to say something like that? Her sister-in-law, Orpah, made the perfectly reasonable, logical decision to just walk away and go back to her homeland. So how did Ruth find the strength to stay? Was she just, a better, more loyal person?
Well, this brings us to a massive paradigm shift right out of the gate. We so often fall into this trap of reading these historical texts as like moral manuals, right? Like they're demanding we copy the behavior of these spiritual superheroes. We look at Ruth and think, man, I just need to try harder to be that loyal. But the commentary reveals the real story here. This is not about a moral superhero relying on willpower. Actually, scratch that. It's the exact opposite. It's the story of an ordinary, incredibly flawed person who is simply reacting to the invisible, preceding grace of God. Ruth's declaration wasn't the starting line. It was actually the finish line of a work God had already begun in her heart.
So here is our roadmap for the explainer today. We'll start by looking at how grace precedes action. Then we'll explore the object of her turning, the depth of that turning, why there was no way back, and finally, how that grace bears fruit.
All right, let's jump right into part 1, Grace Precedes Action. This is all about the invisible hand of God working behind the scenes.
It is absolutely vital to understand that before Ruth ever even opened her mouth to speak those famous words, God's invisible hand was already heavily at work. Just look at these unseen works of grace. First off, God kept Naomi alive in Moab. An older, foreign widow without a husband or sons had practically zero chance of survival back then, yet she lived. Second, God made sure Naomi heard the good news that there was grain back in Bethlehem, which sparked just that tiny little bit of hope she needed to return. And third, God sovereignly placed Ruth right there in Naomi's home. Naomi was deeply bitter. She even wanted to change her name to Mara, which literally means bitter. But here's the thing, she never abandoned her God. God used Naomi's raw, suffering, completely imperfect faith as the perfect channel to draw Ruth in. Ruth's vow was really just the fruit of this quiet, background grace.
Moving on to part 2, the object of turning. This marks the shift from worldly idols to the true God.
This is such a deeply profound yet incredibly simple part of her vow. Your God will be my God. Now remember, Ruth was a Moabite. She grew up worshiping local idols. When she made this declaration, she didn't have some deep, complex theological understanding of the Red Sea parting. She hadn't eaten manna in the wilderness, and she definitely didn't know the Ten Commandments. Her faith was sparked entirely just by watching how her mother-in-law Naomi clung to God amidst deep bitterness and total devastating loss.
And that brings us to a really fascinating takeaway. God so often uses ordinary, broken, and suffering people to reveal himself. I mean, Naomi had nothing, no money, no food, no husband, but she still had her God. This ancient dynamic connects directly to us today. Our own imperfect struggles, our enduring through hardship without throwing our faith away, these are often the exact, unpolished tools God uses to draw others to his grace. It goes to show you really don't have to be perfect to be a conduit of grace. You just have to hold on.
Which brings us to part 3, the depth of turning. Committing to God inherently means committing to his people.
So the depth of turning really means moving from an abstract, just in your head spiritual belief to a tangible, costly commitment to a spiritual community. When Ruth said, "Your people will be my people," she was unpacking a massive theological truth. True faith in God makes it virtually impossible to remain isolated from his community. She wasn't just adopting a new deity in her mind, she was adopting a new family, a completely new identity, and a very new physical reality.
The crucial point we have to grasp here is the staggering cost of her decision. Ruth chose to leave the familiarity of her culture, her language, her home, to become an impoverished, foreign widow in a completely unfamiliar land where she'd be highly vulnerable to exploitation. And why? All just to stay with God's people. This sharply challenges that modern notion we hear all the time, right? The idea that we can just easily say, well, I love God, but I don't really want anything to do with his imperfect church or community. The source material makes it abundantly clear. A heart truly touched by God's grace naturally gravitates toward God's people, absolutely regardless of the cost.
Now let's look at part 4, No Way Back. This is the ultimate proof of a truly transformed heart.
Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. By openly declaring her physical burial place in Bethlehem, Ruth was essentially burning her ships. She was leaving absolutely no path of retreat. She had no idea if she would find food, shelter, or even acceptance in Judah. Literally, the only thing she knew for absolute certain was that she was never, ever going back.
And this just brilliantly illustrates the contrast between these two women. Orpah made a perfectly reasonable, self-preserving choice. She went back to Moab for safety, familiarity, and her old gods. Honestly, no one could really blame her for that. But Ruth chose Bethlehem. She stepped right into the unknown, facing likely poverty with absolutely no retreat. This wasn't some blind leap of sheer willpower. It was a radical choice born of an irresistible grace. She had encountered a God who was vastly more valuable than any safety net Moab could ever offer her.
And finally, part 5, Grace Bears Fruit. Let's look at the incredible generational impact of this unwavering faith.
You know, God never shortchanges those who trust him, and the generational climax to this story is just stunning. In Generation 1, Ruth is a grieving, impoverished outsider. But by Generation 2, through God's providence, she meets and marries Boaz. Fast forward to Generation 4, and this foreign widow becomes the great-grandmother of Israel's greatest earthly king, King David. And if we follow that line all the way down, generation after generation, she is written permanently into the lineage of human salvation. She becomes a direct ancestor of Jesus Christ. God took her willing surrender to his grace and literally wove it into the redemption of the entire world.
So the core thesis of this entire explainer, the big takeaway here, is this. True commitment is always a response. You follow God wholeheartedly because his grace reveals his supreme value, not because of your own sheer strength or willpower. Ruth didn't just grit her teeth and force herself to be loyal. No, God opened her eyes to see a God so beautiful, so reliable, even in the midst of suffering, that she simply couldn't walk away. I want to end today on a quiet but highly provocative thought for you to chew on. In your own faith, have you left a retreat path back to Moab? Think about it. We all have our own versions of Moab, right? Our comfort, worldly security, old habits, those safety nets we quietly tell ourselves we can fall back on if following God just gets a little too hard. Ruth burned her ships. She let grace completely cut off her escape routes. So what safety nets are you still clinging to? And what would it actually look like for you to fully step into the beautiful, unconditional commitment that true grace invites us all into?